The next exam is Tuesday, so don't forget to be preparing for that. You're welcome. Next exam is on Tuesday. I'm going to be looking over the study guide. If you have any questions, by all means, get in contact with me. Let me know what I can do to help you out if there's a particular topic term, something you're not clear about. That I'll be checking my email through the weekend. Try to get back to you as soon as I can. And then, of course, Tuesday will be the next exam. We don't have the next reflection paper is actually 2 weeks from tomorrow, so there's not anything else pressing in the near future. We move from the Reformation now into the 17th century, and this is where we'll cut for the exam, so everything up through today's lecture. And in the 1600s, there are a lot of things that are developing, and it was difficult to try and decide what to include and what to exclude. But as before, we're looking through some different political things, thinking about how Christianity was often intertwined with the politics of the day, both as the kind of force for political developments as well as developing and changing because of things going on politically. The first thing I want to talk about is the 30 Years' War. In response to a variety of military conflicts that were going on throughout the post-Reformation period, there was the signing of the Peace of Augsburg that had largely settled some of the religious conflict in the Holy Roman Empire. And the principle coming out of the Peace of Augsburg was, in Latin, cuius regio eius religio, which essentially means that the ruler of the area determined the religion of the people. So if it was a Catholic prince, that region was a Catholic region. If it was a Protestant prince, it was a Protestant region. Now, there were some exceptions to this, but generally this was meant to be a way to kind of bring some peace to the wars that were connected with this development of Protestantism. It did not, of course, solve the problem, and tensions and struggles continued to develop throughout Europe, often breaking out in riots or revolts. Finally, in the region of Bohemia, the region where John Huss had been, a war broke out when some Bohemian Protestants threw two of the Catholic king's advisors out a window. This happened in 1618 and is known as the Defenestration of Prague. Defenestration refers to throwing somebody out a window. They did not throw off the emperor's roof, because the emperor is in the other part of Europe. If anybody, I shouldn't advocate this, but if anybody really upsets you, you can always tell them that you're going to defenestrate them, which means throw them out a window. But there's a new term for you today. So the Defenestration of Prague, again, it's coming out of this Catholic-Protestant tension. Well, once this had happened, it became a call to Bohemian Protestants to rise up against the Catholics. And so they appealed to Protestant regions to come and help them throw off the Catholic power, but the Catholics actually were the ones to invade Bohemia. They were successful in gaining control of Bohemia and then persecuted the Protestants, the leaders of which were executed. In 1626, it was decreed that Bohemia would be a Catholic country and non-Catholics had to leave. Well, that brought in interference from a variety of Protestant nations, including England, Netherlands, Denmark, all joined in to restore the Protestant king of Bohemia that had been set up after the Defenestration. This Protestant king was actually a son-in-law to the English King James I. So there's all sorts of Protestantism tied up with this. There is the political aspects tied up in this. The war continued for another 2 decades, involving a variety of European powers and kingdoms. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which was a series of treaties between the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Sweden. Essentially, the Peace of Westphalia was an agreement that all would be allowed to follow their own religion. So it wasn't, if your prince was Catholic, you could still be Protestant. And so you could still follow your own religion. If you were Lutheran, Catholic, or Reformed. Reform refers to the Calvinist groups, the Zwinglian groups. If you were an Anabaptist, however, too bad, you still don't get to practice your religion freely in the 1600s. So on the continent, there were a lot of wars, violent conflict through a good part of the early 17th century. In England, there wasn't as much violent conflict, but there was a lot of persecution based on the monarchs in power, the struggle between the monarchs and the common people. Where last we left England, Elizabeth I was on the throne, the daughter of Henry VIII, the third child to take the throne. She died on March 24th, 1603, with no heir. Right, so her half-sister died with no heir. Her half-brother died with no heir. Her half-sister died with no heir. And now Elizabeth dies with no heir. She had also been unmarried and was sometimes referred to as the Virgin Queen. With no heir, rule passed to James VI of Scotland. He was actually descended from Henry VII. He had a daughter named Margaret who married James IV of Scotland, and she's the grandmother of Mary Queen of Scots, who was James's mother. And so this is how James ends up with the throne.
Is that supposed to be the sixth?
Well, when he's James VI of Scotland, he becomes James I of England, because he's the first James to sit on the throne in England. And when he becomes James I in England, he'd actually been ruling in Scotland for about 36 years, so he's not a stranger to the throne. But while predominantly Protestant in outlook, James was trying to find a way to unite all the different groups in England, Catholics and Protestants, but ultimately he could not. He evidently tried to have a fairly tolerant view towards religion until 1605, when a group of Catholics tried to blow him up. Largely, this was in response to a variety of repressive laws against Catholics that had been enacted by Parliament. And so while Parliament was sitting, this group decided to blow them up. Usually connected with a man named Guy Fawkes. It's a little unclear sometimes how involved Fawkes actually was in the conspiracy, but he kind of becomes the figurehead of this. And they're discovered on November 5th, 1605, which is still today even remembered as Guy Fawkes Day or Guy Fawkes Night, when effigies of Guy Fawkes are burnt in England as part of this celebration. Well, that made, of course, James I much more anti-Catholic, and so he starts enacting even more anti-Catholic laws. It's also during James's reign that England begins establishing colonies in North America. In 1607, settlers from Great Britain landed in a region that would be named Virginia after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and sailed up the James River and founded Jamestown. In 1610, legislation was passed that would require church attendance by all colonists. If you failed to attend, you would face a variety of punishments. The Church of England, the Anglican Church is another name, both refer to the Church in England, was the official denomination of Virginia. It was the state church or the colony church. Catholic priests were not permitted in Virginia for more than 5 days. really strong attempt to keep Catholics out. Other laws were passed that prohibited ministers outside of the Church of England from presiding over services. You had to be licensed by the church in order to preach. And when people look at those kind of things, these laws, there's a suggestion about the early history of the North American colonies being religious. But on the other hand, there wasn't a whole lot of religiosity among the people of Jamestown. Most of the people came to Jamestown for gold. And as Virginia developed, there were very few churches outside of Jamestown that were built. The people of the time were described as selfish and greedy, and they were more focused on growing and selling tobacco than they were worshiping God. So it wasn't an overwhelming religiosity of the British settlers at the time. Back in England, James and other Anglican leaders found themselves struggling against some English Christians who believed that the Church of England had not reformed enough. Remember back from our discussions of the Reformation, the Church of England developed because Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce. And so it's a Protestant church in the sense of it broke away from the Catholic Church, but much of the ceremonies, much of the practices, the liturgy was very, very similar to Catholicism, except that it was done in English rather than Latin, and there were some other slight differences. And so it wasn't really established as a Reformation church, but it is, in a sense, a Reformed church because of the breakage from Catholicism. And so here's this group of English Christians who feel there's still many things within Anglicanism that are too Catholic. They need to be revived. Specifically, they didn't believe in the bishop system. That was one aspect of the Church of England that was similar to the Catholic Church, in that there were bishops that ruled over regions and there was a hierarchy. Instead, they believed that each congregation should have its own leaders. So the difference between episcopal leadership, right, a bishop, versus congregational leadership, where the congregation has its own leaders. Largely, these Christians had descended from a group of Protestants who had fled to the city of Geneva during the time of Mary Tudor, who was Bloody Mary, who had persecuted Protestants. During Elizabeth's reign, they had come back because Elizabeth was much more tolerant, but they come back with views that had been shaped by Calvin's teaching. Right? They had lived in Geneva, saw how Calvin did things, came back to England with that mindset. They were referred to as Puritans. Right? That's a name that was used to describe them because they wanted to purify the church. Some of them do go to Jamestown, but face restrictions there. Others go to the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands to Plymouth Plantation to establish a colony there during the reign of James in the year 1620. While James, again, was tolerant of some things, Puritans were not among them. He allowed the passage of anti-Puritan legislation, the banning of Puritan books, and so Puritans did face a variety of persecution during the time. The last thing James is known for, as far as religious things, is the creation of an English translation during his reign. The purpose of this version was to correct previous English versions and their errors. So William Tyndale, for example, had published an English translation. The Geneva Bible had been published as an English translation. The Bishop's Bible as well. But this was supposed to be a translation that improved upon those and corrected some of the things that were considered to be errors in those early translations. It seems that James wanted to make sure, though, that this authorized version, of course, as we most often refer to it as the King James Version, that it supported episcopal governance, right? That it supported that bishop system. But there were some translators on this committee that was developed to translate the King James who had Puritan sympathies. They weren't Puritans, but they admired some aspects of Puritanism. Puritans themselves were technically not to be on the translation committee. So there were things like, for example, the word ecclesia should probably better be translated congregation or assembly, but James wanted to maintain that it was church, because church carried with it all the notions of the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, and so some things like that are predominantly why those terms continue to be used in English translations. Marginal notes were also forbidden in this King James Version. The final publication occurred in 1611. However, if you go back and actually read that first translation, if you thought the King James was hard to understand as it is now, the original translation is even harder because the spellings have developed and words have changed as well. But for the time, it was putting the English version into the hands of the common people. If I remember correctly, I know I sent that email out yesterday of that church building that's now kind of emerging from these receding waters around this time, that was built around this time. Also just recently, original translations, hand-copied translations of some of the translators have been discovered as well. As an individual working through some sort of archive came across these, like the original handwritten translations. I forget what, I want to say it was someone working on the Apocrypha, right? Those additional books in the Old Testament that Catholics and then Anglicans as well. But those documents are 400 years old. In 1625, James I died, and his son Charles became king. He was a firm believer in the divine right of kings, that God had established kings and gave them certain rights. And he also favored that high church Anglicanism, right, that Episcopal system. However, he runs into problems from a couple of directions. First, he marries a Roman Catholic, Henrietta Maria, who is the daughter of King Henry IV of France. This occurs 2 months after the death of James, and Henrietta was actually 15 at the time. But because of this alliance, the French pressure him to remove some of the obstacles that Catholics faced in France. Well, because he wanted to get rid of some of these laws that restricted Catholics, that led to troubles with Parliament, who was predominantly Protestant. And so they were concerned that the stage was being set to bring in a Catholic monarchy. So that's part of the problem. But then there's also a lot of financial problems with Charles and Parliament. Only Parliament could impose taxes. So the king needed them to fight in his wars. However, in 1629, he dismissed them, sent them home. It was actually the 4th time he had done this. And he rules without Parliament for 11 years, which really wasn't something that was ideally under the government at the time. During the time, he continues to struggle with Puritans like his father did. A larger group of Puritans leave England in 1629 to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first group is the group we think of more often. That first group of Puritans under James, those are the Pilgrims, right? Mayflower, Thanksgiving, all that kind of stuff. But it's this second group that leaves in 1629 that is the larger group. Also during this time, the colony of Maryland, named after Charles's wife, Henrietta Maria, was founded by Cecil Calvert, who was Lord Baltimore. Because Charles had granted George Calvert a petition to give him a degree or a parcel of land in the colonies. The Calverts were Catholics, but Maryland was not technically established as a Catholic colony. The official church of the colony was the Church of England, but it was set up as a tolerant colony, a haven for Catholics. And so whenever Catholics faced persecution, many of them were able to escape it by traveling to Maryland.